Don't you think it's about time for a podcast that's more fulfilling? One that's about the vibrant exchange of ideas and perspectives that happens when we actually come together. We got you covered. Welcome to the Deep Blue Project, where the depths of conversation meet the waves of personal experience. This is a real, raw, and unscripted show about everything from leadership lessons to self-awareness, wellness, and the latest current events. We cover it all. We have a rotating cast of guests as we share our personal stories, insights, and opinions on the issues that matter most. Plus, we have a blast while doing it. The Deep Blue Project. It's not just a podcast, it's an experience. And now your host, Chris Workman.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Deep Blue Project. I am happy today to have Kathleen Dias with me. She is a writer for Police One. I have been reading her stuff for many years. She deals with issues that talk about small and rural agencies, so it really hits home for me, and we are happy to have her on. How are you doing, Kathleen?
I'm doing well, and thank you for the invitation.
Why don't you tell our listeners who may not have heard of you, I know most of our probably police officer listeners have, but those who may have not, a little bit about yourself.
You've given them my name. I think probably one of the most important things to know, and probably one of the more unusual things for your regular guests, is I'm not a law enforcement officer. I never have been. I'm a writer. And I started writing about rural policing back in 2016, mostly on social media, on a Facebook page and then an Instagram account, both called The Rural Badge, and started a blog by the same name about a year later when I had been on a forum for law enforcement family and realized that we were not even talking about the same things. We were trying to have a conversation, but my experience was so far removed from the families of law enforcement working in big cities that I felt like the stories were going completely untold. And instead of just running around with my hand in the air all the time going, hey, what about us? I decided to take it on myself. And so that's what I've done. A couple of years after that, one of the editors at Police One asked to reprint one of my blog posts that she liked, see how it did. And when it was a success, they offered me a monthly column writing on policing the rural and remote. And so that's what I've been doing every month since. So that was 2019. So 5 or 6 years now.
Well, I've had the opportunity to read a lot of what you put on, like I said, because being from a small department, it hits home, and it's nice to read the different things that are going on, because when we're living and working in different areas, we don't really know what's going on in other places. We know we're kind of the same because we're small, but everybody has different politics. They have different ways of doing things. They have different rules for their training and everything. You did a story that was called No One Size Fits All. It appears like you kind of took a lot of your stories and a lot of things you've been doing, of all the problems or things that can be different with all of these agencies all across the nation.
That's the thing. That particular column was kind of a roundup of things that I've learned as a writer on this particular topic. You start writing, everybody says, write what you know, and you start writing things because you think you know stuff. And if you connect with people, they start communicating with you and you start to learn things. So the more you write, the more you learn. And the more I learned, the more I realized I had no idea what was going on in the rest of the U.S. outside of our little sphere. My husband retired from a department in the mountains in Northern California, and his entire career and all of our adult life had been spent on the West Coast. And I start talking to family and to officers from different states, from all over the place, and discover The laws are not the same. The culture is not the same. The sources of funding are not the same. Things that I had always assumed were kind of, made up for TV. Like I think the one I started out with was, oh no, he's out of my jurisdiction. I have to stop here at the city limits. And I was like, whatever. Okay. That doesn't happen because in California, all officers are certified by the state and they are law enforcement throughout. They are a peace officer of the state of California. They just happen to wear the uniform of and get their paycheck from a particular municipality or county. And there, you let people know if your pursuit's going, hey, join in, here we come, but you don't, your powers of arrest did not end at the county line. And apparently that is actually a thing. And I had to wait, what? And so one of my friends who actually was working for Orange County Sheriff's Office in Florida was like, no, you're wrong. That is actually very much a thing. And this is how it works. I had to sit there with my mouth open going, really? Explain that to me more. And that was just like the very first thing. And then there were so many more that I started taking notes on it. And yeah, in April that got turned into its own article. And it was just, it just kept getting bigger and bigger.
So it is really different. I have a friend of mine who he's a sheriff out in Minnesota. And one of the questions that he had, we talk about sheriff's offices, because to us, sheriff's offices here where I'm at, they're law enforcement officers, but they don't do investigations. They don't arrest people. They don't do that. They're process servers. Like where he has a full police department and he has a jail. And when I tell him what they do here, he's like, what? How does that happen?
That's exactly it. And then you start getting into other titles that, constable is one of them. And in California, they actually abolished the office of constable when all of the courts were consolidated back in the 90s. So that title doesn't even exist as a thing where we lived and hadn't for years and years and years and years. And then there's places back east where they are still a thing and they're elected. And as you say, they do, like almost exclusively civil process, but may or may not have any training requirements at all. They are a lot of times required to be self-funding, like literally they're self-employed. They only make money by the fees for, the process they serve or those sorts of things. But then you go to Texas and a constable is a fully trained and certified law enforcement officer with full powers of arrest throughout the state. And they do all of the civil process as well and almost always coordinate with the police departments and with the sheriff's office wherever they are. It's a whole other animal than it is even in the other states where that title still exists, but it doesn't mean the same thing.
Right. I saw that you started off in the East Coast before you went to the West Coast, so you have that unique perspective to know kind of how that real big change is from from the East Coast to the West Coast.
I do. My dad was career Air Force, and so it just kind of worked out that except for being stationed in Hawaii for a while when I was a kid, most of where we lived was from Illinois East, and my mom is from upstate New York. And he happened to retire after an assignment in Alabama. So that is where I went to high school and to university. And then, it's like every college kid has got to get out of Dodge as soon as they graduate. And I had family in California. So I moved out there looking for work and ended up getting married to a deputy there in California. And I have to say, it's like I was leaving Alabama and moving to California. And I'm like, this must be some whole other higher plane of civilization. And I moved to this, Sierra foothill town and discovered there were more rednecks per square inch there than there were. I mean, I moved there from Birmingham. It's like it was 1 million people metro back in the 80s. So my first question to my husband before he left to go to work for the night was, but where are the 24-hour pharmacies here? And when he finished laughing, he informed me that was now a part of my past. And, we went on from there. But yeah, and there are a ton of cultural differences In law enforcement, that was another thing that, I'd see on TV. You watch something set in New York, like NYPD Blue or Blue Bloods, and they talk about things like courtesy cards and stuff like this. And I got myself, like shouted down on a social media platform by going, that's illegal. You can't do that. That's a giant ethics breach. And all these retired guys from New York were like, I think if we had been there in real life, I may not have left the room safely. They were so angry with me because to them, that is very much an entrenched part of their culture and courtesy and expectations. And they felt very entitled to it. This is something they have earned. And
Right.
I'm looking at it going, you can't just give people a piece of paper that entitles them to ask for favors because they know you. That's not that was not a popular point of view at all.
Well, we know there was, policing has changed so much since that time, and a lot of what we talk about now is that culture of policing, what we're doing as a profession, even across the nation. It doesn't matter where it's at. I got to give my friend John Clare a little props on the podcast I had with him a little earlier. He calls us, and I agreed with him, Gennials. Like we're kind of that in between group. Like we started out pen and paper, and now we're digital. There was no computers. No computers. We were still writing everything. We were still carrying paper traffic tickets. We were still doing all that. But somewhere in that middle or part of our careers, it started to change, and we had to learn how to do everything digitally. That culture of change had started building in your brains. But if you were one of them guys who had been had 20 years on way back then, they weren't doing anything to change. Like they were like, nah, I'm doing it my way. They wanted to still write paper tickets for the rest of their career, or they retired because they didn't want to deal with it.
There's a saying that I've learned since I started writing this stuff, and that was that the only thing cops hate more than the way things are, change.
Right. Very true.
So yeah.
That's very true. We hate change, but the technology nowadays, it's not a bad thing. I've come to learn that, especially with smaller agencies. If you're with a small agency with only a few officers, and the technology is what helps me survive, because you have to keep up on policies and procedures. You have to keep up on what's going on. So with cameras in your cars, body-worn cameras, your training is all kept online. Everything. If you didn't have this right now, it would be crazy. I couldn't do that because I don't have a secretary. It's me and my officers. I don't have somebody to do that for me. Plus, like many smaller agencies, I still have to answer calls for service. So that's something that I think we get into, and I think when you're doing what you're doing, you see that. That's one of the things that you do a lot of, and I've seen in a lot of your articles, is trying to find ways and give small departments this information and trying to do things that maybe if you can talk a little bit more about these articles that are related to those things.
How I find information to pass along there.
Right.
A lot of times people will reach out to me. That's how I found out about Surlia. And one of the people who was forming that reached out to me and said, hey, we have this idea of trying to gather small departments, rural departments, remote departments, tribal departments. Eventually, I think they're talking about even pulling in game wardens and conservation officers, because even though they work for the state, and that sounds like, ooh, that should be a big department. They're working alone, and they're working very scattered, and a lot of times are regarded as and treated as second-class officers by their states. Their retirement systems will be different. Their access to benefits and things like workers' comp when they get hurt, or what is defined as a presumptive illness or injury for them, are completely different than they are, say, from, I don't know, a highway patrol officer or state trooper who is also a sworn officer of the state. And so it's like we need a voice for these people. If you're to have any political pull at all, the only way to do it is going to be to group together and work together and make your voices heard. My personal kind of illustration for that And it comes from having lived in some really small, really remote places that nobody knows of. It was, it's like Horton Hears a Who. The
Right.
kid book from Dr. Seuss, right? There's all
Right.
these people in this tiny little place, and they're real people, and no one even knows they're there because they're so small. No one's ever seen them, and you can't hear them even when they all shout together at the same time. So you need more and more of them, and they need their voices louder and louder because Whoville is still a real place, and that's
Right.
kind of where guys like you and the people I write about work.
I think we try to tell people that we can talk about this, and the reason that we talk about this and I'm able to have this podcast and I try to bring these things out is it's to reach those people that are sitting in a town that might be in northern Montana somewhere that it takes hours and hours to get to, and there might be two people working there and they cover this immense and large area. And they really barely have anything, but they're doing this job. They don't have access to modern technology. They don't have access to training like all the time because a lot of people aren't taking the time to go to, northern Montana. And I'm not picking on northern Montana. I'm just saying that's very rural areas there where these great people are trying to be peace officers and they're kind of out there on a limb by themselves. So,
That's exactly it. And that is another one of the things I wrote about in the article you were referencing was how much geography affects the difference in policing from west to east. Because as you move further west, the states get bigger, but so do the counties. And seriously, I mean, one of the posts that I wrote the other day, just a little short thing with a picture that I snagged from one of the sheriff's offices in Wyoming, was about a deputy who took a full load of buckshot to his windshield responding to a domestic violence call in a county that, no joke, is like the size of Connecticut.
wow.
And the population density of that county is about 9 people per square mile. And the thing is, they're all going to be clumped together, usually along freeways or state highways and things like that at intersections, which means that you get away from these population centers, however large or small they are. And you can, well, let's put it this way. The last place that we lived, 3 minutes away from our house, and we lived in the county seat, there was no cell coverage for another 40 miles.
Wow.
None. And sat phones didn't work either if you happened to be on the wrong side of the mountain. You looked like a clear sky, but the slope was right here and it's blocking the signal. So you're like, and it's useless. It's dead.
Right.
And that translates into a lot of problems from obviously the basics for policing, like dead spots for comms and backup that's not minutes, but maybe hours away, if it exists at all. When officers get hurt, they're a very long way from an actual trauma center. If they're lucky and someone knows where they are, can get to them, you might be talking about them coming out by ground ambulance to a place where a helicopter can pick them up, to fly them to a regional hospital, to stick them back together and pump them full of enough fluids and blood, to get them to the trauma center, to get them put back together enough that they can then eventually be sent to a rehab in a whole other state. And
Wow.
it's just this giant thing that isn't going to occur to somebody, even in a small town back east, because the town itself may be very small, but everything's really close together. One of the illustrations I use is I'm living in Idaho now. There's 40 something counties in Idaho, and they're all big. And Idaho is 3 times the size of Kentucky, and Kentucky has 120 counties. So you have lots and lots and lots of sheriffs there and lots of small police departments working in with the sheriffs there, and they do all back each other up, and it's not optimum, and they're all very small and usually horrendously underfunded.
Right.
But they're all really close together. And, even if one of them does get hurt, even if in a really small town, they're usually not going to be more than, this sounds awful, an hour or two from a really good trauma center, which is a really long way if you're in dire need, but it's not like having to go to a whole other state for it.
No, I think it makes a great point. I mean, we get, I don't know, we get set in our ways, and we know where we're at. Like we're comfortable with where we work, and we're comfortable with where we are. And people may be listening to this who, you could be anywhere. Like you said, you could be in a big city, you could be in a small town. However, there's a big city maybe 5 miles away from you.
Exactly.
You might have little rural spots, but there's somebody not so far away from you. Where out in some of these places, just like you mentioned, it could be hours for someone to get to you, and you're trying to pretty much take care of yourself. And I kind of want to lead into, you went into the part, we talking about the roids disease, and you actually did a full article on this, but you do mention it in this article also, is that, officers shot by incidents for 5 years. And I think one of the biggest things that I read in that, and I think that people need to know, is everybody sees what happens in the big cities. Everybody, it's all over the news. Everybody puts it on now. And they think, and I had someone tell me this before, and we were looking for a pay rate and scale, trying to get a pay raise or whatever. And I had someone actually tell me once that, oh, you work in a small department, so the chances of you having something really serious happen are very small. I won't say what my face looked like when somebody said that to me, but
did you bite your tongue right in two?
No, I really kind of had to hold my tongue big time, because this job, no matter what you do, and everybody who does it, and the people that are close to the people that do this job know damn well that it could be any time, any second, anywhere in the climate we are today, and even when it was years ago, but even more today, that something can happen to, and is more likely to happen to, an officer who's working in a smaller rural department, because they're out there by themselves, and these people know that. So I think you had on there that one of the things that you had said was, stereotypes and presumptions aside, it's in between towns of 11,000 and 30,000 residents that seem to be least dangerous for Leos than the ones that are 1 to 11,000.
That is,
so I like that. Let's get to elaborate on that.
Yeah. Yep. And to go back to what you said about, like biting your tongue, I'll tell you another reason why I'm writing the stuff that I'm writing now, because I don't work for anyone who can fire me. The worst that can happen, Police One does not ask me back next month, but I can still write on social media. I can still write on LinkedIn. I can still write on my blog and talk to people like you. And there's absolutely nothing that can happen to me. I can't be disciplined. My pay can't get cut, because you would laugh if you found out what I'm actually making per hour by the time I do this stuff. I do. But this stuff needs to be said. And it doesn't make people happy to look at them and go, let me tell you about your sweet little town. And it may be a lovely little town, but the research also says that small towns and rural areas have far higher rates of addiction and substance abuse than urban areas do, with fewer resources to address them. They have higher rates of often sexual abuse of children, of domestic violence, of suicide rates, all those sorts of things that are just going like glossed over because, one, there's no resources to address them, and two, nobody really wants to hear about it. Nobody wants to think that of where they live. And so, I was helping a friend with a project back in 2016, and she was tracking officers shot nationwide. So she had a spreadsheet going, and every time they found an incident, they wrote down the date and where it took place, the state, the agency, how many officers involved, all this kind of stuff. And so I was helping her with that, and I told her my main interest is coming from a rural background. I think there's a whole lot more violence that involves law enforcement officers, attacks on law enforcement officers, officers getting shot, getting stabbed, getting beaten, getting run over. all that kind of stuff, then the public is seeing because there's no national outlet to cover it. But I can't prove it. And she said, cool, I need the help, join in. Well, the fact is that's not happy stuff to track. I'm really not very good at, things like making spreadsheets, and I'm not a professional researcher, and I'm not a statistician, but I can count. And basic statistics are basically counting and then running percentages and things like that. And so I've been doing that. This will now be my 6th year, because I've still got the project going on. And what I decided to do to find out just exactly how many rural officers were affected was to create 2 categories, because there aren't very good working definitions for rural. And I discovered another thing I learned writing about this stuff is there's something called a census designated place. And that's what happens when you're on a map, but you're not even actually like a town. And that's a thing too, is out west, they don't have all like the population designations for city, town, village, hamlet, like they do in a lot of eastern states. And a lot of these shootings, when I started finding them on a map, were actually happening in those kinds of places, really, really small places, but it's not practical to keep breaking the numbers down any further than that. So
Right.
I do note the population of the area, not by like the department where the officer worked, but by where it happened. So I don't care if you're a sheriff's deputy or a police officer or a state trooper or an FBI agent on reservation land someplace. I'm looking at where it happened, because that's what people use as a hammer against officers and department heads like you. They go, this place has only got, 2,000 people. What could happen? Well, the fact is you only need more than one person for there to be a fight. And that's pretty much what happens. And when you're making a living out of telling people no, you don't make people very happy. No one likes to hear that. And that's your job. You come in and tell people no when no one else will. And there are repercussions. So I started tracking it, started running just the basic percentages. And the first couple of years, it was holding pretty steady, that it was about a quarter to a third of all the officers shot nationwide happened in the places where I wrote about. And about a quarter to a third of the officers who died of those wounds were also from the places where I wrote about. And that kind of sounds like maybe it's reasonable until you realize that like 64% of the officers in the whole country work for like 5% of the departments.
Right.
So that means all those other departments are representing only another like third of all the officers in the country, and they're the ones bearing the brunt of that kind of violence. And then over the last 2 years, the numbers of officers who got shot held more or less steady, but the number of officers who died kept increasing. And last year, it was over 50% of the officers who were fatally shot on duty were from the places that I write about. And if I find that shocking, and I've been looking at it like every day for 5 years, I would think anybody else who is reading that, and I've written a column about it for Police Week and Police One each May for the past 5 years, go back and find those articles, read through them. I link all of the stuff that I do, all of my resources, fact checked me. Tell me if you think that that's lining up with those things don't ever happen here.
Right.
Because I'm not finding that it does. And to me, that says these officers need access to resources. They need comms that work. They need good vests. They need firearms training, not just qualification once a year. They need vehicles that work. They need staffing so they're not always going to everything alone. Because one of the reasons when I've talked with people, and I've been talking with people who are involved with, trauma response and EMS and stuff like that about, okay, but why are so many of them dying? Because Rob Lawrence from EMS one was, he ran all the numbers and said, okay, so what you're telling me is an officer who gets shot in a rural area is 3 times more likely to die than the officer who gets shot in an urban area. Why is that? And we can't prove anything, so we're trying to think of why. And as far as we can tell, it comes down to being alone when they get hurt. So there's nobody to evacuate them. There's nobody to pack wounds. There's nobody to provide immediate medical aid, and distance from sophisticated trauma care. Everybody knows what the golden hour is. And if it took more than the golden hour to even find you, probably that's lowering your chances.
One of the things that I was told years ago, and while you were talking, it reminded me of it, that a training officer way back when I started being a police officer said, remember one thing throughout your career, kid. There's a gun at every call you go to because you bring it.
That's right.
So there's an opportunity at any time. And I tell my officers to this day, like, just always remember and be cognizant of the fact that anything can go sideways and turn into a lethal event because you bring the weapon with you every time you go to a call. And we're talking about rural places. It's nothing for somebody to be driving down the road with a shotgun in their car because that's what they do. This is the reality. That's why we're talking with Kathleen today, and we're talking about small departments, and we're talking about small departments across the nation because this is the reality. And people don't see, we mentioned like 80% of police departments in the United States are under 50 people. And half of those, more than half of those, are under 10.
Correct.
So that's what you're dealing with. And this is why we try to talk about small and rural agencies and say that these guys and these women are out there working alone, and they're doing it for almost nothing.
That's something I have a real problem with, and I've actually written specifically on that as well. It's something that I addressed briefly in the One Size Fits All article, but there's also a whole separate article in my columns specifically about the ways it's really disingenuous to justify poor pay for an officer because they work for a small department. And this is one of the places where I can make myself very faintly unpopular once in a while because, very often I'll hear from smaller places, well, but that's all we can afford. And again, going back to I don't have to be politically correct about this. I'm a writer, not a cop, and tough. If that's all you can afford and you can't do it right, then maybe you need to be making another plan. Maybe your very small town doesn't actually need its own department. Why do you have one? And I don't mean that in a confrontational way. I mean, look in the mirror and answer the question. Why are you insisting on having your own department? Is it truly a need? Or is it a desire to have all of the local control and every bit of say over what every single officer does at every minute? Would the money be better spent collaborating with a neighboring small town? Or contracting with a larger agency, if not for all your patrol, then for something else, rather than, honestly, I've talked to some officers that are still making like $13 an hour in certain places. I don't live in a huge metro, and I live in a place that really prides itself on its, cowboy identity. But still, there are fast food places 10 miles from where I live that are starting people at $18 an hour. And they very, very rarely get shot at. Mm-hmm. And they don't work overnights. And they're not asked to buy their own uniforms. And I'm sorry, but, I've see a lot of criticism, whether it's on social media or on different forums. And, well, the officer needs to take some responsibility for their own training. They need to get themselves out to the range and get those rounds, down. And they need to be, taking jiu-jitsu classes and working out in their own time and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, that's a really cool thought. And I understand the, puritanical work ethic behind it. However, if you're paying someone at a level that requires him to hold 2 extra jobs to pay his rent, those things are not going to happen because at some point he has to eat and sleep and poop. I'm just saying.
Very true.
And if you're
Very
paying
true.
him at a level that makes him choose between practice ammo and diapers, guess where the money's going to go? You just have to be realistic, because putting a badge on somebody does not exempt them from the laws of economics. That's where my background is in business and marketing and teaching and things like that. So I'm bringing that kind of point of view to what I'm writing about. And the idea of things like, well, we're going to run it like a business. No, you are absolutely not going to run it like a business. And that would be a very bad idea indeed, because introducing things like profit motive into law enforcement is such an inducement for corruption. And it's where you get small towns that make other small towns a laughing stock, because they decided to make the citizens that they're charged with protecting into a cash pump. You can't do that.
Right.
If you are, you need to stop. And if that's your basis for financing your law enforcement, again, you need to take a good hard look at that and say, why am I doing this? And what's it really creating?
It's just the reality. It's trying to give people the reality. The main reason I wanted to touch on this article, you don't realize how bad it is in some places. But the issue is there's people that are still trying to do this job. They're trying to be those law enforcement officers, men and women who are in these areas that are getting paid barely nothing, because they just have that sense of duty. And it might not go to the small town that wants that revenue, but on the other side, it might just be the people in their town that just want to be that person in between law and order and crime and the things that are happening in their town. And some of these places, you're right, they're paying such a small amount. And they're telling me, and I know people who have done this over the years, I'm just going to say, and it doesn't have to be rural, because I know people who have done it right here, who have paid for their own uniforms, who have went and got their own patches made, who have done all that stuff, because they're dedicated to wanting to do this job. But we're at a point now that I think we see, and we talked about this with Chief Claire a couple weeks ago, and the fact that, it's become, in a lot of places, a bidding war.
Yes.
All departments are losing people because it's become a bidding war. It's become, okay, well, this department's going to pay me $10,000 more, or give me a $15,000 bonus to go there, and I'm just going to say sayonara to you. But as a person, can you really blame them? I mean, because can you blame them? I mean, as a administrator, if you're looking at that, can you really blame them for doing that? Because they're looking at it going, okay, well, I have a family to feed, and I have kids to raise, and I have bills to pay also.
A retirement to save for in a place where pensions are becoming a thing of the past. And so if you're going to shoehorn public employees into a 401k style retirement, how can you possibly blame them for trying to optimize their earning power while they can? Because what they're going to retire on, either because they finally timed out or their body says you can't do this anymore, is only going to be a fraction of what they're making now. You've incentivized that. And that's, again, the principles of economics still apply. And there's kind of this it's like, okay, you can look at me. I have gray hair. I'm not a kid. But there's this old guy attitude out there about this generation just doesn't want to work. And I always want to end that phrase with, for you. Because it's not, I mean, that generation, that's your kids. That's their kids. We raised them.
Mm-hmm.
And can you blame some of them for being really cynical when one of the last people who actually said that out loud to me was a sheriff from a Plains state, small department, financially struggling, and he was getting ready to retire within a month or two of when I was interviewing him, and lamenting the fact that he was having hiring problems. And then in the next sentence, he's telling me that he's diabetic and he can't afford his medicine. The sheriff can't afford his medicine. So let's say one of his deputies needs medicine. How much less can they afford? And honestly, is it even a good decision? Is it even a wise decision for them at that point to work there?
Right.
It doesn't mean they don't want to work. It means they don't want to work there. And I have a really hard time faulting someone for that. And there are a lot of those people out there who just really have that call. They have that drive to serve their community, to be the protectors. And when we find those people, are we not kind of taking advantage of them if we use that as a reason to keep them poor? I find that personally to be a breach of ethics and integrity. I call it outsourcing your dirty work on the cheap. And that's, like I said, why I don't write for anybody that's going to fire me for saying stuff like that out loud. That's kind of my job, is to say that stuff out loud. But a lot of times community members don't necessarily want to hear that. And that's why I say it and you don't.
No, I think that's the reality of things, because as we have to look at it as administrators on the other side, like, I get everything that you're saying, and it's nice that you're able to do that. And a lot of the stuff that you do put out and say is actually, that's what's going on, plain and simple. There's no sugarcoating it. It is what it is. We used to say, you're not going to get rich doing this job, so you better want to love it. And it's kind of a shame that it's still that way, but small departments sooner or later are going to be, and it's already starting to happen across the nation. A lot of departments these small agencies are having to shut down. They're just having to close their doors. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the biggest things about small towns is having a police department is they feel a little safer, because they know if the big departments are probably covering their area, they're not going to have their own personal department. They know that Officer John's going to show up and take care of that. That's not likely to happen if it's a bigger agency covering it. No, it's not that it's their fault. They're covering so much area and other stuff that they have to keep themselves open for the big stuff that happens. But even bigger agencies, it's not just small agencies, bigger agencies are taking a hit. And that's why they're changing what they're doing now and trying to entice others to come from other agencies, because they can't even get people to come in and make $90,000 or $100,000, because people just don't. It's not that job anymore. People don't want to do that job anymore, and that's the harsh reality of it. The harsh reality of it. So when you find them quite few that want to come in and do it, you're trying to hang on to them, because there's not many. You went from thousands and thousands of people taking tests to be police officers back in 20 years ago. Now you're lucky if you get 50. So
50 would be a really good number, actually.
Exactly. We touch on these things, and Kathleen, I thank you for coming on, because I know some of these things are controversial to people, but it's really not. It's really not. It's just reality.
Well, it shouldn't be. And honestly, I think this is one of the places where history and civics should be coming into play, and the idea of things that, like law enforcement, like sanitation, is a public good. And in a public good, it means everybody's paying for it, whether they're using it in that immediate moment or not, because everyone is better off for its existence. And that's not really something that we're taught much anymore. And that concept is kind of going away. Because the thing is, it's like, even in such a competitive environment as it is now, if the culture of the community and the department remains attractive, then the pay only becomes a problem below a certain baseline. And I find that baseline to be a place where I can pay my bills without having to work a ton of extra side gigs, so much that I don't have a personal life anymore.
Right.
If you can't pay above that level, then the pay really is the problem. It really is the problem. It's not the culture at that point. Not being able to rent a house or let alone buy one in a neighborhood where you haven't arrested, all your neighbors and you don't have to commute for hours to get there. That's pretty basic. If you can't get to the basic standard of living, if you can get to that basic and it's an attractive place to work because the culture is healthy and people back each other up, not just physically, but emotionally and socially. Leadership that is respectable and respectful, and someone who actually leads instead of just tells people what to do. Folks will run through walls for next to nothing for someone like that. And the problem with that is those leaders almost never stay forever. And I know we found ourselves in that bind a couple of times where it was like, man, this is a great place to work. And then someone retires or takes a job someplace else, and the replacement isn't worth what you're making anymore. And you can get that kind of churn. But I believe a good leader can create the kind of atmosphere that you can end up with a waiting list, but you've got to be able to pay enough that they can make their bills. That's a basic, and that's not an unreasonable expectation.
No, not at all. And you know what? I don't think I can add anything to that, because I think that's just a great way to kind of leave it off to say, hey, that's what we need. And that's the way you need to look at it. I thank you, Kathleen, for coming on. I really thank you for spending some time with me. I know you're out in the west side while I'm on the east side, but I hope that once again we get a chance to talk or maybe even see each other in person somewhere down the line. Please, if you want to read any of Kathleen's stuff, you just go to Police One, or you just Google her and all of her things on Police One will come up and you can read all of her stuff since she started there. Thank you, Kathleen. I greatly appreciate it. Is there anything else you'd like to leave us with before we go?
Absolutely not. It's been a great visit, and I appreciate the invitation. I'd love to talk again.
Well, thank you. And you have an awesome evening. And everybody, I hope you liked hearing from us. If there's some things you liked, okay. If there's some things you didn't like, you know what? That's okay, too. We're all here to just try to educate everyone and give you some information. And we like to help our fellow officers down the line to believe that you are not by yourself. Everybody does know what you're going through. So thank you very much, and you guys have an awesome, awesome evening. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Deep Blue Project. As a father, husband, friend, and someone who loves to chat about anything and everything, Chris brings over 3 decades of public service experience to the table. With a background in firefighting and law enforcement, along with degrees in criminal justice and behavioral science, he's seen it all, and he's learned a thing or two along the way. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to like, rate, and review. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, find us on LinkedIn and X at Deep Blue Project. Find our website at deepblueproject.com. And to reach out, send an email to deepblueproject@outlook.com. Keep keeping it real. And we'll see you next time on the Deep Blue Project.